Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 432, Radical Spiritual Care. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we're continuing our series of episodes on the intersection of Judaism and disability with our guest, Elliot Kukla, who's an author, artist, and activist advocating radical spiritual care. Elliot Kukla is the founder and director of the Communal Loss Adaptation Project, CLAP, which uses the spiritual tools of Jewish tradition and BIPOC-led disability justice activism to mourn, adapt, and heal. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that 3 new mini-courses have just started in the Unyeshiva, but it's not too late to sign up because you can watch the first recording and then just catch up with the class for the remaining 2 classes. The topics of these classes include Jewish zines, Jewish approaches to birthing and dying, as well as a class called Eheyeh Asher Eheyeh, the Torah of Wholeness and Belonging. So head over to judaismunbound.com/classes where you can learn more about these classes and sign up. Another thing you're not going to want to miss is our amazing annual 24-hour festival of Jewish learning and unlearning in honor of the holiday of Shavuot. It's entirely free of charge. And there are already over 400 people signed up for this event, and it isn't even taking place for another couple of weeks. The event takes place from Saturday, June 8th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time and continuing for a full 24 hours through most of Sunday, June 9th. This year's Shavuot Live is shaping up to be truly epic, so head over to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot, that's SHAVUOT, to register. And now back to this week's conversation. This is the 6th episode in our series on disability and Judaism, and we're excited to speak with Elliot Kukla. The project that Elliot Kukla founded and leads, the Communal Loss Adaptation Project, honors the stigmatized and disenfranchised losses of disabled people, as well as sharing the wisdom of disability culture to help all people adapt to a rapidly changing world. CLAP makes use of art, culture, and media, as well as indigenous and diaspora spiritual traditions to tend to the collective losses of this moment, including pandemic, climate crisis, and political violence. In addition to his work with the Communal Loss Adaptation Project, Elliot Kukla was named one of the 50 most influential Jews of 2019 by the Forward newspaper, and his award-winning essays have been featured in the New York Times, National Geographic, and NPR. In 2006, Elliot Kukla received rabbinic ordination from Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles and became the first openly transgender rabbi to be ordained by a mainstream Jewish denomination. We're thrilled to continue our exploration of Judaism and disability. So, Elliot Kukla, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. It's so great to be here.
We don't often start with the guest's bio, but there was some information in your bio that, and I'd like to ask complex questions, but it says in your bio that they're interconnected. So specifically, you talk about tending to grief, dying, and becoming more ill or disabled. And you also talk about radical spiritual care. So I'm curious what radical spiritual care is, but also what both of those mean and how they're interconnected.
Great. Radical spiritual care is really a term that I coined for the work that I do. I've been tending to people in moments of deep vulnerability, which is usually illness, dying, and coming to the end of life since 2007. And my training is as a rabbi and as a chaplain. So that originally started in hospitals and hospices and nursing homes. And now I work mostly on bereavement outside of institutions through grief groups. And I run a project called the Collective Loss Adaptation Project. And the term radical spiritual care is a term that I came up with to make it clear that I bring a justice-based perspective to that. the ways in which we are impacted by grief and illness and disability is filtered through all the oppressions in the world. And that is not always reflected in the ways that we are cared for. In many ways, those experiences are extremely universal. All of us come to face our mortality. All of us come to face grief, and those are extremely human experiences. But the extent to which our loss and our lives are recognized and honored is very impacted by things like white supremacy and homophobia and transphobia. So bringing justice-based analysis into how I offer care and empower people to look for care is what I'm implying by talking about radical spiritual care.
Help us understand a little bit about like what that looks like on the ground, like
Mhm.
how, like I think we have a basic idea about what pastoral care is like or the kind of grief care that you're talking about, although I think a lot of us don't actually have a good sense of even what that is in the regular circumstances, and certainly not in this more radical circumstance. So can you give us a little bit of a sense of what that means in practice?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really great question. The first question is, what is? I would say spiritual care as opposed to pastoral care, just because the term pastoral care has such a history of Christian hegemony connected to it. And in other words, and by hegemony, I mean a deeply cultural Christian worldview as a, not just Christian religion.
And that itself is part of what you're talking about, right? Is using understanding what parts of our language that we're not even aware of are coming from places that we don't know.
Absolutely. So really, I'm going to try to answer that question in parts, although the two questions are really completely integrated because how I think about spiritual care is part of how I think about justice and treating each person as if they're not disposable, which so much of our healthcare system and the way we think about illness, grief, and dying is not set up to honor everybody's lives. So in terms of what spiritual care is, just period, for me, spiritual care is you can have all of the best healthcare, you could have all of the best tending for your body and still have core existential needs. And spiritual care is the work of tending to that, which is very different than the work of trying to restore functionality, which is often what the work of psychology sometimes is. Often when we think of people in crisis, in deep grief, they will go to a therapist because they want to, feel better or be more functional. The work that I do is not exactly about that. The work that I do is about being with people in the depths as opposed to trying to fix or cure the depths. The idea that those times of life, grieving, illness, and dying, are not problems to be solved or pathological or abnormal in any way, that in fact they're naturally spiritually rich. They open up core spiritual questions for us, like who am I? Where did my person go? Core universal spiritual questions that we all have. And they're extremely painful at the same time. And we would rather have those questions asked in less painful ways. But what we really need in those moments, I believe, is to not be abandoned in them. The work of spiritual care for me is joining people in those moments. So then how I kind of bring the radical into it is, say I'm in the room with someone who is not just dying, but also trans. So then I have extra things to hold because as people are coming into the room, there's also questions of misgendering that person, for example. So you're facing the abyss of oblivion and people are getting your pronouns wrong. You can imagine how painful that is. So to be able to be a spiritual care provider who embodies not just the dignity of all life, but the specific dignity of trans life is how the radical spiritual care comes in.
I really appreciate what you said about being with people, trying to pretend that there's some transformation where everything's fine when people know that's not the case. It doesn't actually feel good for a lot of people. So I appreciate you naming that. I want to bring in another piece, which could feel like it's a new topic, but I think is actually very, very similar, which is that you've written powerfully and spoken powerfully about chronic illness and the need for our society to stop, disposabilizing, treating people with chronic illness as unimportant. You've written beautifully about how when there's a chronic illness, often people's questions or small talk are like, so are you hoping to get back to normal soon? Like back to real life, quote unquote. I love the piece you wrote, and we'll put it in the show notes, about this notion of quote unquote real life. And like for people who have chronic illness, like that's real life, and there's not always just a future around the corner that's going to be different. It's a similar situation, and it makes sense to me that somebody who has experienced that from society would be well situated to not play this fake transformation role with other people in the way that you described. So I'd love to go in that direction. Are there ways that you would bring in our society's relationship to chronic illness and how much work we really have to do on that front?
Absolutely. I mean, I think so much of the work that I do is really just about treating people as people. Chronic illness is one of the top ways that we dehumanize, which is ironic considering how unbelievably common chronic illness is. You know, in one of my essays, I wrote about how I was unprepared for how much stigma and dehumanization surrounded the experience I had of my first really deep chronic illness flare, when I wasn't able to be productive. I wasn't able to get out of bed and care for myself, and I needed help with tasks of basic living, like bathing and feeding myself. And I was widely gaslit and disbelieved by my, doctors who were like, you just have to try harder. And that's such a common experience, as someone who's with people with chronic illness. Almost everyone with chronic illness has that experience, being told that the experience that they're having is not the experience that they're having, and they only need to try harder and they could do something else. I was the first transgender rabbi, and for a number of years, the only transgender rabbi. And I'm familiar with feeling like an outsider. But nothing in my life prepared me for how lonely and isolated I felt as those first years of living in bed and being so widely disbelieved. Thank God I'm so lucky to have a partner who has experience with chronic illness, who advocated for me and believed me. But the outer world experience of isolation was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. Statistically, about 0.2% of the world is Jewish, about 1% of the world is trans, 100% of the world is going to experience what I experienced in terms of a period of time where you can't care for yourself. And yet it was that period of time that made me feel the most isolated from humanity of anything I'd ever experienced before, which is pretty shocking considering how unique some of my experiences have been. And that is how much we isolate the experience of chronic illness, and not just chronic illness, but illness, period, needing to be cared for, period, from human experience, even though it is one of the most universal parts of being human there is. So what I take from that is that we are cutting off this core part of our humanity, that by making chronically ill people disposable, we are losing a core part of our humanity.
Thus far in our unit of episodes exploring disability Torah, disability justice Torah, here and there, we've brought in the topic of visible disabilities and invisible disabilities. Related to what you just described about how many people's experience is that they're gaslit. They're told that their experience is not their experience. I think it's not that doesn't also happen to people with very visible disabilities, but I think for people with invisible disabilities, where some outsider could perceive that since they can't see it, there must not really be anything there. It must be somehow an illusion. That gaslighting experience may be even more common among folks with invisible disabilities. Can you give us a little bit the distinctions descriptively between visible and invisible disabilities? That may sound like a dense question, like one can be seen and one can't, but I feel like there's more there. And the second piece is experientially, what are different ways that people experience the challenges that you're describing?
For sure. Yeah. I question the label of invisible. I've heard the term non-apparent disability, which I think is a good phrase. It's like, what are you looking for? Often people who are referred to as having invisible disabilities, there's actually all sorts of things, markers of disability, but it's not what people are expecting to see. So it's not a wheelchair, it's not a visible disability aid, but someone might have a disability placard, or they might be telling you they're disabled, or they might have a stack of medication. There's all sorts of symbols of disability that people have that aren't what we're trained to look for, that are present and often willfully ignored. I've had the experience of pulling up to a parking spot, putting a placard up, and stepping out with my service dog with a vest, and still being yelled at for taking up a disability spot because I appear to be able-bodied. So in that case, it's not invisible at all. There's very large symbols, but it's not the symbols that they expected. So just to name, like, invisible to who? Yeah. Another thing I want to say about this is that issue we started with of meeting people where they are. Often the challenge is that in more apparent disabilities versus less apparent disabilities, or disabilities that meet the stereotype of disability versus disabilities that don't, the gap between what people assume and where you are different, but the challenge is often the same in terms of people assuming what you can do and where you are, as opposed to meeting you as a person. The kind of disabilities that people can readily identify as disabilities, like being a wheelchair user. The challenge often is people assuming that they can't do things. For example, someone coming up behind them and pushing their wheelchair for them when they're completely adept at managing their own wheelchair, and that's actually risky and dangerous and uncomfortable and an invasion of privacy. People assuming that wheelchair users have, lower verbal intelligence when there's no reason for that. So that is a constant dehumanizing issue for people with the kind of disabilities you see right away. For people like me, it's the opposite, where it's assumed that we can do things even when we very explicitly say that doesn't work for me access-wise. But it's a similar issue at heart, which is not trusting or believing us.
So I wanted to ask a question from what you were saying earlier about this is going to happen to all of us in one way or another, and yet people who struggle or are not able to take care of themselves are someone that's ignored in society. And I wanted to get your take on why. I mean, the simple answer that I think everyone gives is that it's fear. It's a desire not to want to see that because it makes me afraid that that's going to happen to me. I mean, is that your take? Or is it kind of more subtle than that? And I guess related to that is my question about what can be done. I feel like a lot of times there is a moral claim to be made for sure. But one of the things that I've been trying to articulate about, at least my take on Judaism, is that Judaism's not satisfied just saying you should think differently about this. Judaism, of course, tells you should do things different, but it tells you what to do. One of the things that's just part of being human is actually being not too good at living life. I mean to do something, but I don't know how to do it. And Judaism, I think, over the years has said, so we have a way. We tell you this is what you do. When you wake up in the morning, you do this and you do that. And maybe that'll cultivate more sensitivity over time. And maybe it won't, but you'll still be doing the right things. So I'm wondering if we were to sort of reconceptualize Jewish practice in a certain way around addressing the things that you're raising, what might that look like?
In terms of why so much ableism, for sure, fear of death. There's a way in which disability reminds us that we aren't in control of the body. In terms of how that's become so systemic. So there is a thinker, T.L. Lewis, who is a wonderful Black disability thinker who has thought a lot about how ableism is at the heart of other oppressions, who refers to ableism as basically the fertilizer that helps the orchard of all other oppressions grow. What T.L. Lewis points out is that basically this idea that there are some bodies or minds that don't fit the standard of normal, beautiful, intelligent, which is what ableism is. This is really the heart of saying some people are people worthy of life, nurturing, flourishing, and some people aren't. This is the heart of eugenic thinking and at the heart of almost every atrocity, if we take it apart. So to make this concrete, if you look at enslavement of Black people here in the United States, it was justified by core beliefs that Black people were feeble-minded, as a race were inherently less intelligent, all sorts of other beliefs about the bodies and minds of Black people being inferior. That's ableism, the idea that having different kinds of bodies are inherently inferior. Land theft of Indigenous people was also based on similar ideas of inherent weakness. Homophobia has often been hinged on medical ideas of queer people being feeble-minded, devious, perverted, all sorts of things that are completely connected to ableism. If you look at, for example, the Holocaust, disabled people were the first people to be oppressed, the first people to be rounded up. Nazis referred to disabled people as useless eaters, which is this like core dehumanizing phrase that opened the path for dehumanizing of all sorts of other people. In terms of what we can do about this, in terms of Jewish practice, as Jews, what we often do, as opposed to saying, let's reject that system, as Jews, what we often do is we feel the weight of all that history. The way that anti-Semitism has often functioned is imagining Jews as disabled in some sense. You know, that sort of classic Nazi anti-Semitism went straight from useless eaters to Jews being feeble, deviant, all those ways. So a Jewish response is often to say, no, we are able-bodied. We can, go out there and be healthy and able-bodied and militaristic and all of those responses, which is connected to white supremacy and everything else. A Jewish healing response, it is to reject the ableism of that at its root.
I think that it's important to dwell there a little bit because that word useless, unproductive, in a society built on capitalism, built on racial capitalism, to have a person be distilled to being useless or unproductive really is sort of the essential bad that one could be. Or maybe I'm overstating a little, but I think that's kind of the thing, is that capitalism distills goodness to production. And so I love what you said about like how this is shaded into anti-Semitism and the Jewish response of, no, we're not these things you think we are. We're something else. I want to think about that with disability too. And this is where we can start to turn to some of the positively inflected joy sides and not just the pain sides. I read a lot of different articles by you. One of my favorite was that you wrote this piece in the New York Times, and it's in the show notes for those who want to check it out, that was arguing for laziness. It was an argument for laziness, which, again, to a person shaped by capitalism, which is the vast majority of us today, that hits as like the most rebellious, revolutionary thought. I mean, we take pride here at Judaism Unbound, having a lot of outside the box thinking, but like, here's the case for laziness is not something we've really dwelled in. But I think that's a case of saying, oh, look, all these folks, disabled and otherwise, are pointed to as, oh, they're somehow useless, unproductive. What if we actually say there is deep Torah, there's deep wisdom in not just focusing on production, in that laziness? And so I'd love to open up to you that framework. I mean, you could say things that are in that article, or you could say whatever has evolved since then. But like, why might we want to lean into a case for laziness, even as that might hit people as like some kind of secular heresy? And how does that connect to the ways in which you, in all sorts of other ways, want to help us better empower disabled folks?
Yeah, absolutely. That remains one of my favorite essays. And it actually turned into a children's book, which will be coming out soon. I had a
Oh,
children's book
yay.
editor. Basically, it was suggested to me to turn it into a children's book. And I wrote a children's book based on it. It's called The Lazy Day. So the term lazy itself has a really nasty history and very connected to all those things that I was just talking about that are really deep in American culture. The Puritans who colonized America used the idea of lazy. It was a weaponized idea that really justified enslavement and land theft. And that remains a huge part of the notion of lazy is we tend to use lazy to refer to poor, Black, oppressed people in general. We don't generally call billionaires lazy, no matter how much they are benefiting from other
Hmm.
people's labor. And in that essay, what I really talk about is not only do we all have times in our life when we can't work and need, cyclically need time, we're facing a moment as a planet right now where we actually need to find a way to work less and do less because the planet itself is exhausted. The world is actually, not only are we in a moment of burnout, almost everyone I know is burnt out in some way from the pace of life, but the planet is literally burnt out. Even though we've internalized this idea that we always have to be doing something, it's not actually serving either us or the world to do things, and yet to constantly feel like we have to be busy. Rest and renewal is desperately needed right now. And Judaism, of course, has this rich tradition of valuing rest through Shabbat, with, the day of rest, and Shemitah, which is agricultural year of rest, which happens every 7 years. And deep within these Jewish traditions of rest, there are also traditions around debt release that go along with when you rest, as well as when you rest, you are not working the land and letting those who need to come and eat from the land. So there's built into the Jewish idea of rest a kind of economic rebalancing and a recognition that within these notions of laziness and not having rest, economic oppression. So Judaism recognizes that a situation like we have now, where there isn't room for rest, automatically leads to economic imbalance, which is what we have right now.
Judaism doesn't say, oh, just rest whenever you want.
Yeah.
Right? Judaism says rest on Shabbat, rest during the Shemitah year. And it's not necessarily that by the inverse property, that means every other day you should drive yourself ragged. But some people take it that way. And I think that what you're saying is no. So I'm wondering, just thinking about Judaism, thinking about in particular what we're talking about here in terms of disability, how we might move from, yes, Judaism has values of rest. And by recognizing Shabbat and Shemitah for what they declare Judaism's values of rest. We can now take that value system and apply it to the world that we live in and say, the world is wrong, the world is off kilter, we need more rest. And I'm curious, how that would be ritualized, or do you think it needs to or doesn't need to? Because people might say, yeah, in an ancient world where people were supposed to work 7 days a week. I'm not sure if that was true or not. I don't know if anyone knows, but let's pretend that that was the world before Shabbat was invented. And then the Jews invented Shabbat, and all the other people probably said they were lazy, but they said no, they said, yes, we're embracing that. But whatever they said we need this in order to live a good life. But we're doing it in a very organized way so that both we can do it sort of right, and also so that eventually you guys will not say that we're lazy anymore. You're going to adopt it for yourselves, and sure enough, they did. And so I'm wondering what that might look like updated for what you're talking about.
If we go to the earliest biblical descriptions of Shabbat, Shemitah, Jubilee year, the amount of rest that is described is way more than we have in a modern context. Even by the time of the Mishnah, when the Mishnah being the earliest layer of Jewish legal theory from the first and second centuries. Even by then, the rest practices are modified because it's felt like people can't actually be as lazy as the Bible wants them to be, as the Torah wants us to be. So the expectation for laziness is quite high. And in terms of why it becomes less, there is a deep recognition in the way that these practices become codified that rest and grief are connected. It's become more common for people to recognize, yeah, we're really tired. We need to rest. And there's been more of a like trendy surge of things like sleep vacations is like one of the biggest trends of 2023, and like all sorts of things you can purchase. But what all of those things don't really grapple with is that rest and grief are completely connected to each other. If you are really going to rest, you need to lose things. You need to lose activities, money, relationships, sometimes not just little things. And at the same time, in order to really process grief and loss, like all the grief and loss we're going through in the world right now, because it's changing so much, we need to rest. That there's actually, on a biological level, we need sleep to be able to move out of the shock stage of grief, to even begin to understand that a loss has happened, to rearrange our worldview. We need rest and time. But the Mishnah recognized that. So that what the Mishnah did was it took these very high expectations for, you said it's not that much rest. I think really not doing anything for 25 hours a week is like way more than anyone I know does. Even a very orthodox understanding of Shabbat now, going by the Mishnah, is a whole different thing, right, than what the Torah is talking about. So what the Mishnah did is took this very high expectation for rest and was like, okay, people aren't really willing to lose that much, and made it doable. This isn't quite answering your question of what to do now, but if we could taste even a little bit of that Torah freedom, it would be enormous, even for an hour.
I really like that you landed there. I'll be blunt. I think Jews take for granted, we just take it as a truism when there's like interfaith conversations and like, what are some lessons that Judaism has to bring in the grand scheme of different religious things? Like, I think one of the first things that most of us would say is, wow, there's this value on rest because we have Shabbat and that's part of the calendar. I got to be honest, I don't think it's true. Look at what Jewish communities do for Shabbat.
Yeah.
If anybody who did not already know that this thing called Shabbat is supposed to be about rest, if they saw the calendar and the actions and activities of what a quote unquote Shabbat observant Jew does week by week from Friday night till Saturday night, I do not think there is a sliver of a chance that the word that they would come up with is rest.
Right.
What do? You race into, like, by a traditional rule, but you have to do a bunch of things Friday afternoon for just to get ready for it. So you kind of go into the day of rest exhausted if you're doing this by the book. Then what's the first thing you do? Shluf? No. Shluf being take a nap? No. You go to services. You pray. And that's in many different denominational contexts. Then you sleep in, right? Because it's about rest. So of course we would sleep in on Shabbat. No. You wake up early to go to services Saturday morning when you just did it Friday night. You're there for a few hours, and then, okay, I'll grant that in many contexts, the afternoon is a little less sort of regimented and structured. In some communities, even that afternoon space is not fully rest. But then, before much time at all, you're in saying goodbye to Shabbat zone and like Suda Shishit, the like closing meal, and then you're in Havdalah and you do a bunch of things. Like, it's full of words. It's full of like out loud or liturgy. It's full of stuff. The idea that rest is the thesis statement descriptively of what happens in Jewish communities in 2024. And I'm Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, like, I don't think anybody is actually living into this. And I think we should wrestle with that, because if we're going to go to other communities and say, like, one of the most amazing things about Judaism is that we value rest. well, then I should be able to go to a space of Jewish community of whatever kind, and I should feel like I'm entering a space where like the people in that space, the leaders, the affiliated members, the whatever, they have like embodied, lived out ways of resting. Like, I'll tell you, part of why I don't go to Saturday morning services very much is because I think it's silly. Like, it was strange to me that I was like setting my alarm clock on the day I'm supposed to rest at a time where I would then have to get ready. I know I'm like going on a rant here, but like to get to Dan's question of like, what do we do? How do we think about this? I don't think it is descriptively the case that we're actually nailing rest as a Jewish community. That's a failure to everyone, not just disabled folks. It's a failure to everyone. So would you push back and say maybe there's corners that are doing this better? I'm happy for that to be what you do. But like, might we have a collective project to do here that is valuing that laziness, that rest, that side of things a little more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that bringing in the voices of disabled people really helps because, I mean, for me personally, I didn't choose rest, it chose me. So I was forced to slow down because of chronic fatigue. I didn't want to lose all the things that I had to lose because of rest. I was forced to, and because of that, something else happened. In that space where all of that busyness was, there was room for something else to happen, which was relationship and learning how much I depended on other people. Didn't mean that I wasn't still grieving all those losses. And as my chronic illness has ebbed and flowed in moments where I don't have to be so slow, I often just go right back to, to a certain extent, that busyness. But bringing in the wisdom of disabled and chronically ill people brings in that perspective. In that article on laziness, the perspective I bring in is that before my child was born in 2018, I was afraid that my chronic fatigue would be purely a liability as a parent because I really didn't have any models for chronic fatigue being anything other than a problem in parenting. There's really no models of chronically ill parenting in the media as anything other than a tragedy, despite the fact that statistics show that probably between a quarter and a third of Americans have chronic illness. So a lot of parents have chronic illness. And what I discovered once I was a parent was that chronic fatigue actually in many ways is helpful in parenting. In this moment of in 2024 parenting that is so often so incredibly overbooked, of like so many of the parents I know are in this constant like bringing your kid to this thing, to this thing, to this thing, which I just can't do. And my partner can't do either. We have to we are forced out of it. And that means that we have to parent in a really different kind of way, which often means a lot more time just connecting with our kid and connecting with the world around us because we're not able to do other things. So we have to find, a lot of games in bed and a lot of games, lying on the grass, looking at the clouds. And that has allowed for something completely different.
So I want to go in another direction, which you're an artist. You're a visual artist, and that's great. And I don't want that to slide on by and be something we miss. I went to your website, and all our listeners should go to your website, elliottkukla.com, and you have this visual art page. And my first thought as I scrolled was like, cool. Second was I noticed the titles of them, of a number of these pieces. And some of them, Sheep, that's the title of one of them. Loved Little Sheep. Big fan.
Thank you.
Others, Invisible Illness Iceberg, Migraine, Self-Portrait of My Immune System. Those are a little bit more like on the nose to this conversation about disability, Torah, that we're having. But I'm curious about all of it. And in particular, I'm curious, like, from your perspective, is it, my sense is that it's not this. Is it that art lives over here in one corner and your work channeling the Torah of disability justice is separate? Or is it actually this integrated, connected piece? So like, you're an artist, and I'd love to hear how that connects to all of this.
I mean, it definitely is integrated to everything else. In many ways, the most direct connection to the spiritual. Most of my work is more verbal and writing, and that's what I've made most of my career out of. But that is all a translation. And in a sense, my paintings are the most direct expression of what's happening in my life. And most of the paintings on my website are from a time in my life when I was too sick to write. And so I painted. And that was all I was able to do for about 5 years in that time of like grappling with lack of productivity. I painted mostly lying down from bed about my experience in that time. I've painted my whole life. I've painted since I was a child. I actually have a degree in visual art. But in that time of bed life, I was very impelled to like express directly what the experience of bed life was like. I was mostly nonverbal. It was very hard for me to put a sentence together because of illness and fatigue. And I'm such a verbal person. You can tell talking to me. And I had this very strong need for that experience to be seen and witnessed, which is, really a quality of loss-filled experiences for people to be able to witness them. So that visual art was a way for it to be seen.
We've talked a little bit about COVID in this series. And I mean, I think that I'm curious how you're thinking about COVID, and in particular, Jewishly. It's actually reminding me to go back in the early years of COVID, where in the early days of COVID, when we were talking about maybe people would think differently about COVID if we said that it was an anti-Semite, because it's actually harming a lot of Jews. Right. And you can say, well, it's also harming other people. Yeah, but it's also harming Jews. So it's an anti-Semite. And then people would actually like get up in arms about it and would be more likely to do something different. So I am reminded of that thinking because, again, maybe that's the way that we want to have people thinking in some dramatic different way, because it's not clear to me that COVID will ever be over for anyone. In other words, it's just part of the biodiversity of planet Earth now. And I guess my question is, what are we supposed to do now? And what, from a kind of, both from a disability standpoint and also, I think, from a kind of grieving standpoint, what do you think that we should do about COVID? And I guess I keep asking this, but can Judaism help?
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like one of the biggest issues is the lack of grief. The lack of public memorialization of all of the losses of the pandemic is really stark. We have lost so many things collectively over the past few years, not just from COVID itself, but really triggered by COVID. So, there's the loss of, more than 1.2 million Americans. There's the loss of people lost countless jobs. From those 1.2 million Americans, there's approximately 9 grievers per person who died. So to give you a sense of more than 9 million grieving people right now. There's all the identity shifts that came along with it. There's like a lot of people who lost core beliefs in the idea that a healthcare system would work for them. There's losses of hope, huge mobility that happened during the pandemic. So there's like so many people who lost homes or lost friends because they moved. This is just like the tip of the iceberg of pandemic loss. And then, of course, in the years since the peak health emergency, I'm not going to say since the pandemic because there's no real end, but since that core, the peak of lockdown and peak of focus on the pandemic, there has been non-stop loss. We've had climate emergency after climate emergency. We're enmeshed in 2 huge global wars right now in the Ukraine and in Gaza. We've had mass shootings almost every day in this country. Forgetting the statistics right now, but it's enormous. So the amount of loss that everyone is holding is unbelievable, and almost all of that is unmarked. And there's a lot of studies that show that unprocessed loss leads to depression, addiction, isolation. And I think we're seeing that cultural wide. And the thing with grief is that when it's expressed, it connects. When someone shares a story of loss, we feel closer to them. So much art is based on that. But when loss is repressed, when it's not talked about, it brings people apart. Society is getting more and more fragmented, more and more isolated, and the lack of expression of pandemic grief is a huge part of that. And Judaism, I think, absolutely can help with that, just like all of our spiritual traditions. Judaism has this core awareness that grief needs to be named and witnessed. We don't even start marking death until the burial. A yahrzeit is not a yahrzeit, which is the date of the anniversary of a death when it's honored, is not actually the date of the death, it's the date of the burial. Your tradition generally understands that grieving doesn't begin until a loss is announced and witnessed. And that's where we're at as a country and really globally right now. Grieving has not even begun. Healing hasn't begun because things haven't been named. What would it be like right now if every time you went to synagogue, there was some acknowledgement of the amount of grief that people are holding? Not just an opportunity to name whoever you want to name before Kaddish, but some kind of collective loss recognition. And that is the heart of the project that I direct right now, which is the Collective Loss Adaptation Project, which we have a few different projects, but one of them is creating a tangible memorial in the legacy of the AIDS quilt, but not a quilt. It's actually a web of masks to honor the losses from the pandemic, to, recognize this need for concrete symbols of loss.
So often with our episodes, I think internally, both Dan and I, maybe especially me, we're trying to find an arc to end on a hopeful note. It's actually sort of like the tradition of the Haftorah. You're supposed to try and end on the high note in those sections of Jewish text. But I feel called today that point of grief that we just sat with in that last question, it's the right place for us to end.
Mm-hmm.
And it calls back right to the beginning about how you are somebody who doesn't try to necessarily take people out of where they are, transform them from a place of grief to something, quote unquote normal, but rather to sit with them together. So I'm grateful to you, Elliot, for being with us and helping us, even as we've been talking about all these things, to sit a little bit with our grief. And I know that our listeners are too. So thank you so much for joining us.
I think we often think of grief and hope as in tension with each other, but I think that there isn't hope without creating space for grief, that grief really creates room for hope. Thanks so much. It was really great to be with you.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. A reminder, we've got the amazing, the wonderful, the extravagant, extravaganza, that's why it's extravagant, Shavuot Live. 24 hours of Jewish learning and unlearning. It's coming your way June 8th and 9th. That's Saturday through Sunday. A couple days before Rabbinic Shavuot. If you're curious why that is, then you'll have to listen to our podcast in a couple weeks. But we're having Shavuot Live. You can sign up for it by heading to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot. That's judaismunbound.com/SHAVUOT. We hope that you will join us for some awesome learning. We've got such a great lineup of speakers that we'll be announcing soon. So don't hesitate. Head to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot. And as we close this episode, we want to encourage you to be in touch with us with any questions, thoughts, ideas, visions, whatever you've got. And you can be in touch via any of the following platforms. There's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. There's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode, information about our work, lots of goodies. And you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we're deeply appreciative for any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way, and you can do that on either a monthly recurring basis or just via a one-time gift at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.